There is a certain place in any discussion of any one thing in existence where knowledge ends and the great vacuum extends on out into infinity. Ray Bradbury. Harvest. Part 1. Blue Sky. The blue sky was vast. Cornstalks reached to the heavens, unfurled green leaves turned upward like praying hands with crispy brown fingertips. Late September heat simmered and circled. The antlers of the male flower pushed through the top of the stalks. Pollen lifted from the knobby stems in the autumnal breeze, clung to the feet of hungry insects, found the silky threads of female hair in a 500-acre mating dance. The semi-sheathed beards took it in, the shy ladies fertilized, ready to birth budding shafts of sweet corn. A joyous miracle that would be plowed, harvested, and repeated. The time for reaping was near. Winter was still far off, but summer had been long left behind. At the edge of the harvest rested a white church, its broad plank siding bright and clean. The tall arched windows marched along its sides were stretched shadows, tinged with midnight blue where hazy sunlight caught the glass. Out front, an ancient gnarled oak craned up past the steeple, thick leafy arms stretched outward in every direction. Its massive trunk stood near the entrance, where it had endured for more than 150 years, settled firmly on its roots, stealing life from the soil, its weathered bark far older than the church and even the immense crop surrounding it. But age and frailty are close friends, and a poison ran through the great tree. Dehydration and decay festered in its veins. Leaves, most the size of an adult hand, lay strewn along its base, browned and weathered. The arching branches still clung tightly to an assortment of summer holdovers, the clingers-on dangling lifelessly as ancient Chinese fans, adorning the dying tree with a ghastly dystopic headdress. The entire milieu a symbol for the end of all things, or at the very least, a season. And yet the great tree stood, stubborn, clinging to life and pride, like a dying giant in a fairy tale. And on this autumnal day it watched wearily, as a broken line of cars approached from the distance, each chased by a cloud of dust. A spattering of parishioners, en route for the ceremony to come. Carrie wore white and stared dazedly through a church window at the seemingly infinite army of marching green stalks. At the edge of the crop she observed a clay-colored cottontail slip briefly onto the perimeter of shorn grass, sniff the air, then shoot back into the folds of the cornfield. Mother sipped coffee in the corner, a napkin between palm and cup ready to catch any wayward drop that might infect her best yellow dress. Carrie's bridesmaids wore cauliflower blue silk, with a lace top and only one shoulder exposed, a concession she'd made in exchange for serving liquor at the reception. Beth and Trish took turns pouting lips into the vestry's lone mirror, smoothing eyebrows, tucking loose hairs. They were chatting enthusiastically, but it was white noise to Carrie, static. Trish had flown in from school. She was sweet and harmless, fat and plain. Beth was pretty but petulant, liked to mouth off to impress whoever was within earshot. She'd slept with the groom once, before he and Carrie had been serious, and both girls had been forced to swallow resentment like sin-eaters in order to remain friends. The three women had known each other since preschool, but were not as close as some might believe. Deep down, Carrie had secretly hoped they wouldn't come at all, but, well, here they were. The vestry was small, and after a few hours pacing its confines, primping and filling the enclosed air with banal gossip, Carrie had begun to feel claustrophobic. Staring out the window at the navy blue sky and bushy green field eased her mind and settled her nerves. She noticed clouds plotting in the far distance, rubbing shoulders like hazy mountain tops. Navy blue? Carrie thought, distracted from her inner musings. Had the sky really turned a shade darker than it was only minutes before? Carrie closed her eyes and cursed under her breath. She prayed for a beautiful day, a perfect day. She also prayed for peace, and perhaps a little quiet, as the constant attention from her attendants wore thin. Thankfully, her overly fretful Nana, the most vocal and challenging of the small group, had left to secure arrangements in the sanctuary. Carrie figured she had Pastor Willard's elbow by now, pacing him through his well-worn Book of Common Prayer to steel his resolve against adding any modern flourishes to the traditional ceremony language. "Carrie, darling." "Mother, you should eat something." "I've had a sip of wine, and Nana brought lemon cookies. I've had 3. Carrie patted the taut tummy of her embroidered wedding gown. "Besides, I'm too nervous. I'll eat at the reception." "If you don't faint first." "Such a humid autumn, my God," her mother said, patting her throat and chin with a tissue. "Girls, go find a pitcher of water. Some iced tea." They laughed and ignored her. It was warm, especially for the season, but Carrie thought stifling the more appropriate adjective. Thankfully, the church had brought a fan into the vestry, which pushed the heavy, flower-scented air around enough to keep any dewdrops of perspiration bursting from her pores. Despite her gown being full-sleeved and high-necked, the fabric along the arms and shoulders was light, a semi-opaque lace that allowed her tan skin to breathe. And despite what she told her mother, she wasn't nervous in the slightest. Anxious, perhaps. Parker was a good man, handsome. He would run his father's quite profitable wheat mill one day, the largest in Gehenna County, securing their financial future. Her anxiety stemmed not from her future husband or her tedious mother, but from a nagging, damnable black string which tugged at the back of her mind. A black string that wore overalls socially and knew all of her most private thoughts, her secrets. A 6-foot problem with blue eyes and haystack-colored hair. Eli. Carrie's heart beat faster at the thought of him, and she clenched a tight fist, shut her eyes, said another prayer. "Stay out of my head," she thought, knowing the futility of the command. Because he was there, swimming inside her, swirling around her thoughts and kicking at her heart. A ghostly presence that carried a worn suitcase, bursting with a lifetime of memories, tied shut with that same dark string. Then, without her consent, that black string gave a tug and slid free. The kids were hidden from the larger world beneath a leaf-strewn canopy and the heavy shadow of surrounding trees. Storm clouds laid thick along the sky's underbelly like smoke from a house fire. In the distance, thunder rumbled. "God wants in." Carrie rolled her eyes at the joke for the 100th time. Felt like the 1,000,000th. "So let him in, dummy," she snapped, her bare feet folded beneath her knees in the matted tall grass. She picked at the rip in her dress, the fabric covering her bony knee having been rent by a splintered branch while she'd climbed a low-armed mulberry. Eli lay supine, eyes studying the arching branches high above. He wore overalls and a white t-shirt, stained with a young boy's persistence. His feet were bare like Carrie's, his heels blackened and rough. His light-colored hair was buzzed to stubble because of high heat and a recent bout with lice, his soft face reddened by a receding summer. The makeshift creek whispered along beside them, a narrow ribbon brought to life by the wet season. The stream connected Jackson Pond to a state park miles away. When it rose high enough, it carried trout. Eli's daddy had diverted the creek so it split the property between their 2 crops, running it through a dense thicket of basswoods, shrubby oaks, and sugar maples. It also created a park for the children, a living playground of trees to climb, dirt to furrow for planting flower and corn seeds, a cold stream to mine for smooth rocks and minnows. Rainfall pattered against the leaves that surrounded them, tapped against the covering above. Thunder rumbled a second time, rolling across the broiling gray sky from east to west. Carrie didn't hear the crack of distant lightning, so decided they'd stay a bit longer before heading home to schoolwork and chores. She slapped Eli's knee and he smiled at her. "What? Do something." "Like what?" She shrugged, scratched behind her ear, and looked around for inspiration. Her eyes fell upon the water, then twitched back to Eli, who watched her closely. She nodded toward the water and he gave a half grin, then focused his eyes on the stream. Carrie waited. After a few seconds, she felt a sharp gust of wind puff against her back, heard a whisper in the trees. A cool breeze tangled around her bare legs like serpents made of air, and she stared in fascination as the water of the creek began to bubble furiously, then rise in thin pillars from the surface, one by one, to form a line 6 long and high as her hips. The pillars bent at their midsections in unison, forming a bow of water-stick soldiers awaiting her command. She giggled as more tufts of wind tossed her hair, struck her face in pockets like dissolving cotton. Eli sat up and the water-stick soldiers collapsed into trickling chaos. The pillows of breeze vanished, and the air lost its magic. He smiled, pleased with himself, pleased he made her happy. She started to speak, but he held up a hand, stalling her. "Watch," he said, and began to lightly rub the pads of his thumb and pointing finger together, his eyes intent on the motion. "Just watch," he repeated. "I'm watching, geez," she said, but despite her tone was captivated. She hadn't seen this one. A tendril of smoke rose from between his fingertips. In the next moment there was a pop of spark and a soft snap of air, as if a million oxygen particles had simultaneously broken apart. A yellow sliver of fire rose from the motion of his fingers, then grew. It reddened, fattened, and flickered. Slowly, as if releasing a butterfly without wanting to damage its wings, Eli spread his fingers apart so they splayed flat. He held his palm up to her, the lick of dancing flame lifting from his skin, reflected in her wide brown eyes, her dark pupils quivering with an orange inner light. The storm outside their shelter grew. The wind beat more fiercely against the trees, battered and twisted the sheltering leaves above. Rain infiltrated their harbor. Fat, cold drops dimpled the creek, tickled their faces, soaked into their hair. "Eli," she said. He shook his head, eyes narrowed with concentration, then gently lowered his hand to the lip of the brook. He brought his face toward his palm, to within inches of the flame, and softly blew. The fire, now deep red and yellow-hatted at its curling top, slid smoothly off his skin and onto the creek. It rested atop the surface, bobbing and jerking in place with the motion of the cuts and shimmers of the water. It bumped and swayed, but did not go out. "How are you doing that?" she asked, a stunned whisper. Eli studied the flame, eyes never leaving his new creation. "Air, mostly," he said. Carrie got onto hands and knees, settled in beside the warmth of her friend. Together they watched the buoyed flame, now 3 inches in height and wide as a big toe. She rested her fingers lightly on the top of his wrist. "Eli," she said, "do it again." 20 minutes later, they knew it was time to go. The storm had picked up, and the wind and rain fell through the barrier of leaves with ease. Lightning had flickered in the distance, snapping the air like a whip, and was encroaching. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not wanting to leave but knowing they could not stay. At their feet, the stream continued mindlessly along its path, unaware of its riders. 20 flames flickered and danced atop the water. The children watched, transfixed. One in giddy awe, one in deep concentration. The light and heat of the flames were enough to warm their bare feet, illuminate his blue knees, her yellow dress. She imagined small fish rising to try and eat the fire, finding heat and pain instead. It was both cruel and beautiful. "Okay?" he said, and she heard the strain in his voice, a tremor she hadn't noticed in her excitement. She looked at his face. What she thought to be rain was actually beads of sweat dotting his temple, forehead, and cheeks. He looked pale in the gray-green light of their shadowed domain. She rested a hand on his back, as if her support would add to his strength. "Okay, Eli," she said. "Let it go." He exhaled, and she watched with wonder and sadness as the flames, as one, slipped down into the cold stream and were smothered. Parker took a long swig from the bottle and passed it back to his brother. Too much, he thought absently, his reason a fluttering veil. He felt the whiskey go to his head and swore it off until the ceremony was over. The guys were getting shitty, and that was fine with him. He'd be getting shitty as well if he could. But that would not go over well with Carrie, or her mother and Nana, who frankly could both be pains in the ass. "Guys, go easy," he said half-heartedly, wondering if Brock was going to do something stupid to ruin his wedding. Parker had already caught him taking a piss in one of Pastor Willard's potted floor plants, in whose office they'd been caged until the guests arrived. Parker thought maybe the plant was fake, and that the growing stain in the Berber carpet beneath the pot would be a tricky problem to explain. Brock was younger, but he was a big guy, a former all-state offensive guard who could lift a hay bale on each shoulder and carry them around easy as you please. Parker had seen him do the same thing with giggling, kicking girls on 100 youth-fueled nights under the lights, under the stars. To make things worse, Brock had a devil in his heart, a temper like no one Parker had ever known, and it was best not to chastise him when he'd been drinking. Henry and Tuck were easier, more manageable. They weren't smart or dumb, just bored and happy to go along with whatever made their little corner of flat-assed, cornfield carpeted Iowa even a smidge more interesting on a day-to-day basis. Brock tucked the fifth into the crook of his elbow and pressed it to his chest like a slippery baby. "Don't worry, Parker. We're not going to get drunk before your very first wedding." Tuck snickered, and Henry went to the door for a peek at the church lobby. "Looks like folks are showing up, Park. Aren't you supposed to greet them, say hello?" "No," Parker said, standing too quickly and fighting a wave of drunken dizziness before finding his feet. "That's you guys. You two are supposed to be ushers. Remember the rehearsal?" Tuck pulled mints from the sport coat of his tuxedo. "Here," he said, taking two and passing the tin to Henry, who followed suit. "Don't worry, Parker," Tuck said, standing and dusting off his pants. "We got this. Thanks." The mints got put away, and the two groomsmen left the office. Tuck was about to close the door when he stuck his head back in, an eat-shit smile on his face. "Besides, smells like piss in here." The door shut, and Parker sat back down, unsure why he'd stood in the first place. Brock sniffed loudly, then chuckled. "Shit, sure does. Sorry, Park." Parker waved dismissively. His stomach rumbled and acid coated his throat. The tuxedo was hot, and the collar chafed his neck. The air-conditioned office did stink, and it was getting warmer by the second. Too many bodies. "Crank the AC, huh?" he said. "And find me a glass of water, will you? I'm dying here." Brock nodded, handed him the bottle, which was unpleasantly warm to the touch. He went to the straining window unit and turned the temperature knob all the way down. "I'll be right back. Drink that, relax." Parker thought that if he drank the hot whiskey in his hands, he's absolutely 100% sure as shit be puking up his breakfast in the same planter Brock had recently whizzed in. Nonetheless, he nodded to his little brother, his best man. Brock left, and finally, thank God, Parker was alone. He set the bottle on the pastor's mahogany desk and lowered his face into his sweaty hands. He shook his head and moaned, felt revulsion slither through his guts, swimming through intestinal channels of black doubt. "Parker, Parker, you dumb shit," he said, the words muffled, the stink and heat of his breath folding back into his face, stinging his nostrils. The stench was bad enough that he finished the thought internally. "Just what the hell do you think you're doing?" The guests began to arrive. Carrie heard a steady increase of voices from the front of the church, where the pastor and, if they hadn't run off to a bar, Parker's friends were greeting them. She hoped those assholes were behaving themselves, and shuddered at the thought of being related to that mad gorilla Brock for the rest of her life. The half-wit's bulk was surpassed only by his idiocy and indecency. Twice he'd hit on Carrie, after she was engaged to his brother. When he drank, he was a wrecking ball of violence, bad manners, and worse decisions. It made her constantly worried for Parker, and she could only hope that once they were married, and he was living with her instead of his idiot brother and their clueless parents, things would be better. He would be smarter, more responsible. It was possible, wasn't it? "Carrie dear, how are you?" She turned to her mother and smiled, her recently whitened teeth gleaming, brown eyes luxuriously darkened by mascara and eyeliner, lustrous brown hair pulled loosely back, awaiting the veil. "Fine, Mom. Just, ready to get this over with." "How romantic," cooed Trish, as she shoved what must have been her millionth lemon cookie between lipstick-smeared teeth. Carrie supposed she should be thankful to avoid the full eye roll on top of the dripping sarcasm. "Stop it. You're giving me the jellies." "I think you have all the jellies you need, fatty," Carrie thought, then instantly regretted it. She was becoming a cranky bitch, and only in her 20s. It made her sick with fear how much worse of a person she might become as she grew older. She forced a smile at Trish. "Poor choice of words," she said. "I'm just, it's a lot of stress. But I'm happy and excited." But Trish had moved on, already going back to Nana's cookie plate for crumbs. Beth put a hand on Carrie's arm. "It's gonna be awesome, hun," she said. "I'm so excited for you two. Just focus on how amazing it will be to finally be married." Beth's voice rose in pitch as she spoke, reaching a squealing crescendo at the M word, and Carrie tried to feel some excitement, to unearth some sunken inner thrill to suit the supposed bliss of the occasion. She had started to reply when Beth's buoyant face sank into a frown, her blue eyes narrowing and looking over Carrie's shoulder out the window. A wrinkle crumpled her brow like she'd caught an invisible dagger between the eyes. "Oh no," she said quietly, as if remembering a childhood loss. Carrie's smile faltered and she turned. Slipping through the sun-splashed corn was a lanky shape she would recognize anywhere, even in the darkest night. His blonde hair was combed, a first, and he wore a brown herringbone three-piece suit that looked short at the cuffs and ankles. Likely the same suit he's had since high school, she thought. And for the first time that day, Carrie's smile wasn't forced. Cars lined the edges of cracked pavement that constituted the church's small parking lot. Relatives close and distant made their way from their vehicles toward the church entryway. A bitter fall wind had picked up, and women held onto their hats as men shoved their hands deep into the pockets of Sunday suits. Children laughed and ran in their own moderate finery, enchanted with the idea of being at church when no sermon was imminent, like attending a birthday party in a classroom. As the guests filed into the foyer, Parker's friends were there to shake hands, a mixture of bourbon and mint on their breath. Henry and Tuck twisted wrists and smiled sheepishly at the older men and women, most of whom had scolded one or both of them at some time or another during the boys' childhood years. Brock waved at a few familiar faces, but made no attempt to engage. He stood like an immense bulwark near the door of the pastor's office, inside which his big brother brooded in solitude. Brock's dull eyes lit up only once as he watched the guests fill into the foyer, their happy chatter cluttering the space between heads and ceiling with inane remarks and forced reconciliations, overly enthusiastic greetings for those they had lost contact with or secretly didn't care for in the first place. When Eli entered, whispers intensified and eyeballs darted beneath floral hats and greased comb-overs. The boy was taller than most, and his neat stack of blonde hair was a furred golden bob, resting atop a darker palette of browns and blacks, a dark sea of heads. He smiled as he made his way through the throng, saying hello to those that held no animosity toward his peculiarities, his gossiped history as an oddity, as a close friend to the bride. Brock's wide brown eyes became drunkenly alert and followed Eli as he made his way through the cluster. He scowled, jaw muscles bunched, teeth grinding behind meaty cheeks. He waited until Pastor Willard, with the help of those two toadstools Tuck and Henry, began ushering folks into the chapel for the ceremony, then pushed himself away from the wall, wobbling slightly. He belched acid and tapped the flask resting in his coat pocket for strength and reassurance. He was eager for another drink, but held off for the moment, savoring the sweet anticipation of feeding the dragon, the liquid lizard with whiskey-brown scales that lay coiled in his guts, one that whispered, "All will be well, Brock, old boy. Just stick with me and we'll do great things. Great things." Brock snorted and walked down the short hallway that led to the pastor's office. He opened the door without preamble. He needed to have a chat with his big brother. Carrie opened the door a crack, the width of an eye and a lightly rouged cheek. She noted the faces of the guests, most of whom she knew immediately, a few she had never seen before. Her mother was hidden away along with her Nana, the two of them holed up in a cramped nursery waiting for the first chords of the opening music to signal it was time for them to be led down the aisle and seated. Carrie, Beth, and Trish had wanted a few minutes alone, presumably to have some private girl talk, before meeting up with the older women via an antiquated bathroom the vestry shared with the nursery. The real reason for their delay was to secure a moment for their own pre-ceremonial toast, using the 3 airplane bottles of vodka Trish had tucked away in her purse. "Are we going to do this or what, sunshine?" Beth said to Carrie's back, holding her uncapped bottle aloft as if releasing a genie. Easy, you lush, Carrie thought, and continued to scan the crowd, most of whom were now finding seats within the worn wooden pews, some for the bride, some for the groom. Frantically, she continued to search the chapel, knowing time was running out. And then she saw him. He entered, laughing and lightly touching the shoulder of Widow Brewer, the beatific old lady who had fed them slices of pie, cookies, and great icy glasses of lemonade from her back porch on hot Sunday afternoons, after they'd worked up a dirty sweat running through the fields, climbing trees, or playing in the creek. Carrie watched as he helped the old woman sit down near the front on the bride's side. She studied his face, looked for signs of pain, of discomfort, of something dark hidden behind that cordial smile. In the end, it was the eyes that gave him away. They were constant, whether he was laughing or studying the pews for an appropriate seat. She saw the sadness there, saw the void in those eyes she knew better than her own. My blue eyes. Beth chirped from behind with increased urgency. "Carrie, we're running out of time." Carrie dropped her eyes, let out a breath. She closed the door and turned, her smile strained. "Yes, of course. Here." She reached out as Trish handed her one of the small plastic bottles. "To Carrie," Trish said grandly. "May she be happy forever." The 3 girls tapped the plastic necks together and drank. Carrie downed the liquor in 3 swallows and gasped happily, staring at the empty bottle as if it held magic. "Hoo boy," she said, and they all laughed. The alcohol burned her stomach pleasantly, lightened her head. A warm calm spread through her as she looked past her two friends and out the window that faced the fields. The September sky had turned a deep sea green, and clouds were building like ink-stained cotton above the acres of stalks. The jostling crowd of plants waved gently, as if saying hello, or demanding her attention. "Looks like rain," she said quietly, and the gentle push of alcohol released the tether tying her memories to the old wooden dock of her past. And, so released, the memories drifted through the seaway of time into her present. "Looks like rain," she said. He laughed. "You think?" The rain fell in a deafening torrent all around them. A billion vertical broken lines of liquid Morse code, repeating the same word into the earth. Life. 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 The repeated message was indefinable joy to their ears, the mad applause of every earthbound child. The riotous, rushing sound of rainfall was disrupted only by the distant rumblings of an angry beast with a belly of white forked swords. A god who filled the sky, whose footprints were continents. The gapped planks of the shed walls couldn't hold out the chilled October gusts, but the corrugated tin roof kept the rain off their heads. They'd made a dash for it from Wilson Road, along which they'd been trekking on a return trip from a matinee that she'd loved and he'd squirmed through. An epic love story. When the sky broke, they detoured through a patch of ripe pumpkins at a dead run and into the beaten shed, the doors too rotted to hold a lock, the contents too sparse to warrant one. The minutes stacked as they waited for an abatement in the downpour, but the storm appeared strong and long for this world. Flashbulb lightning split the window shade of infinite blue-green above the horizon. Carrie rubbed goosebumps off her bare arms, while Eli knelt by the shed's doorless entryway, stared at the growing puddles in the mud just outside their shelter. "I suppose we should prepare some dinner," she said, hoping for a smile or another laugh. But Eli seemed to have wandered again, away from her and toward the elements of the earth, his playthings, his special bond. "Perhaps a hot bath. If we had a basin, I'm sure you could manage something." He stood smoothly, a long shadow tinted by the jade sky. When did he get so goddamn tall, she thought. They had both changed over the years, but even through life's alterations they stayed close throughout high school, the midsummer graduation already becoming a distant memory. Best friends forever, she supposed, and fought to define the swell of emotion she felt at the thought. Despite his size, she still saw him as the little boy whose flannel back she'd followed on a ragged sprint through cornstalk fields, the pale, skinny brother she never had, who always let her climb one branch higher, simply for the enjoyment of hearing her gloat, who lay at her side beneath a midnight sky shattered by stars, clumsily holding her hand before she'd finally pull it away, turning his tension to gloom. Now this boy, this man, stared toward the heavens, studying the clouds, she guessed, looking for his head most likely. "Hey, Eli," she snapped playfully, tapping his broad back. "These jokes don't write themselves, you know." He spun with a jerk and stared down at her, as if surprised at her presence. She gave him a sardonic, "Here I am" look, turned her palms up. She never once thought of her sleeveless cotton dress, daffodils on sky blue, and the way it clung to her wet skin, how it might have been giving him X-ray vision. This was Eli, after all, and she just couldn't relate to his perception of them, despite her best estimations of his feelings. Carrie refused to apologize or acknowledge something so shallow, especially when they were part of something so much deeper. And why doesn't he see that? "Funny as always," he said, but his eyes slid off her, focused on a dark corner of the shed. He scratched his scruff of blonde hair. "Getting cold." "Yeah, and I gotta get home. Promised Mum I'd help her decorate the house," she said, using her hands to express her Halloween vision. "I'm thinking paper skeletons, a laughing jack-o'-lantern, some serious cobwebs. The kids will eat it up, don't you think?" He nodded, his face a coal-black smudge against the backdrop of midday rain. "You figure it's what, half a mile to your place?" "I guess," she shrugged. "I'm half frozen to death already. A little rain ain't gonna kill me. Seems we got no choice, unless you want to sleep here." He nodded again and turned toward the shed's wide opening. His arms hung at his sides, thumb pads resting against the hips of his overalls, fingers splayed. After a moment of thought, perhaps the making of a decision, or the solving of a particularly hard math problem, he raised his hands to chest height and began to rub them together as if rolling a ball of dough. Carrie felt the air stiffen, heard the sound of rain grow muffled. She flexed open her jaw at the sudden pressure on her eardrums. Eli turned his palms upward, as if carrying 2 trays made from air, and stepped to the mouth of the shed. "Stay close, Carrie," he said, and it sounded as if the words were spoken in a phone booth, clear and intimate. She pressed herself against him, pinched the back of his shirt. She clung to him lightly as they stepped onto the wet earth, and despite what she knew of his powers, she braced herself for the assault of ice-cold rain on her head and shoulders. It never came. He continued to walk, and after a few moments increased his pace. She clenched his shirt more tightly and stayed close as she could without tripping on his heels, as if he were holding an umbrella for them both. After she fell into a rhythm with his steps, she let go of his shirt, slipped a hand onto his bare elbow to steady herself, then stared around her with amazement. She watched the spill of rain run off the surface of what she could only think of as a bubble, a protective shimmer of air he'd formed around them. Slowly she reached out, pushed her hand through the invisible liquid sheet of wind and rainwater. Rain splattered against her palm, and she laughed with wonder. After a moment, she retracted her arm to the safety of the shelter, skipping to keep pace with his long strides over the soggy terrain. They walked the half-mile wordlessly. She knew how much he needed to concentrate, having been privy to 1,000 of his extraordinary enchantments over the years. When they finally reached her house, she stepped past him and onto the front step of the awning-covered porch. She danced up 2 more wooden steps and spun, wanting to embrace him and laugh at his miracle. Her smile froze. He was bent over at the bottom step, just under the lip of the porch roof. His breathing was hoarse and ragged, his face ghastly pale. He was shaking as if burning with fever. "Eli?" He turned his face to her, and she stifled the scream that rose in her throat. His piercing blue eyes were gone, the sockets filled with muddy whites, as though he were a blind man. Dark blood ran from both nostrils, slid in dual lines down his face to embrace his upper lip. "Jesus, Eli!" she yelled, and without thinking pulled his long body to hers, embraced his trembling form. "Let it go, sweetie," she sobbed into his chest, almost shouting in her fear. "Please let it go!" Against her cheek she felt his chest rise, then deflate. The thumping of his heart steadied and grew faint. A heavy breath slipped from him. The sheltering pocket of air surrounding them evaporated. The harsh sounds of the world poured in unfiltered. Wind rushed into her ears, the biting air snatched greedily at her arms and legs. A bitter chill smeared across the back of her neck, as if traced by a ghostly hand. His weight fell into her, and she was barely able to lower him to the porch floorboards. She rested his head, his eyes, his ghastly white eyes, on the porch and rubbed his cheeks, pushed back his sweat-slicked hair. His eyes fluttered closed, and she rested a hand on his forehead. His skin was hot as fire. She pulled a blue handkerchief from his hip pocket, the one he always kept tucked there, and wiped the blood from his nose and lips. Without thinking, she kissed his temple, his cheeks. She sat back and waited. "Eli?" she said. After a few moments, his face softened. The strain left his forehead. Some of his color returned. He opened his eyes, and she was sick with relief to see bright blue eyes staring back, a twinkle brewing deep within them. A smile curled his blood-smeared lips. "Are you all right?" she asked, still worried but growing angry at the same time. He nodded, then slipped his fingers behind her head and drew her gently to him. They kissed, and she knew she would never love him. Carrie pulled away, a hand on his chest. "You scared the shit out of me. What happened?" He sat up and shrugged. "That was a long walk," he said, as if in explanation. She silently swore at herself for not paying him more mind along the way. He sat up straighter, rested his back against the chipped white paint of a porch beam. For a while they sat together in silence, watching the rain, and that was enough. "You should get going," she said finally, watching the gutters sluice water into flower beds. She held his hand and squeezed. "Eli, you shouldn't ever kiss me again. Not like that." She watched him closely, searching for a response. A stiffness, or anger perhaps. But it was like he'd simply disappeared, and in the place in which he sat rested a void. He pulled his hand from hers and stood. He stepped into the downpour, was immediately drenched. He studied the horizon. "You think I don't know how to love you," he said, his voice soft and broken amidst the harsh rhythm of the rain. She said nothing, unsure if she'd even heard him correctly. He twisted around and studied her, a quizzical look on his face, that crooked smile. Or maybe love isn't what you're looking for. He turned his back on her once more, his face tilted to the sky and the spitting gray clouds, as if searching for something lost. "At least I kept you dry," he said. "I suppose there's that." Without another word or another look, he started home. She watched him as he walked away. Watched until he was a rain-smeared blur of blue and blonde, standing out against a distant copse of dark green firs, then vanish inside. Eli found a seat near the back of the church, a row empty but for a sour-looking pregnant woman he didn't recognize, and a rough-looking man in a suit but no tie. He figured them for distant cousins dragged in from a cross-state farm, bitching their way to the church in a beaten-down truck, and a morning fight unsettled. Someone tapped him hard on the shoulder, and he twisted around to see Henry Munson, one of Parker's groomsmen, and all-around dickhead, staring down at him. Eli thought he looked a little drunk. His forehead was dotted with sweat, his toothy smile slippery. "Hey man, what's up?" Henry said. His too-wide grin and sunken eyes gave him the look of a malnourished jackal. Eli nodded and said nothing. Henry rested a hand on his shoulder, his eyes darting around the room before settling once more, albeit restlessly, on Eli. "Listen, man, the bride and groom are doing some quick pre-ceremony photos while they can. Just, with friends and such. They don't think they'll have time after because of, other obligations and whatever." Eli felt his pulse quicken, but forced it to slow. He knew this day would be hard, but he was here for Carrie, whatever pain that may bring. "Sounds grand, have fun," he said, not wanting to hear the request. Not wanting, truth be told, to be here at all. He began to feel the heat of Henry's pressed palm making its way through the fabric of the thin suit, fought the urge to shrug it off. "Yeah, well, Carrie wants you to come do a quick photo, dummy," Henry said, finally removing his hand and taking a step back, as if to lead Eli away. "So let's go. They don't have much time." Eli considered a moment, wanting to turn his back on Henry, to ignore the request and the slick weasel who'd brought it. He wanted to reject it, like he rejected the wedding. Like she'd rejected him. "I don't," he started, then stopped. He sighed, dropped his gaze to his lap, large hands resting on his knees. He turned them over to study deeply lined palms, searching for answers. He noticed, with the sudden heat of shame, how the cuffs of his brown suit coat settled inches high from his wrists, how frayed threads spilled from the left cuff, a permanent ink stain soiled the milk-white shirt beneath. Who am I to demand anything? He thought. And who am I really? He considered a moment more, then stood. He noticed the quick stagger of uncertainty in Henry's eyes as he rose almost a foot higher than the groomsman, whose smile had slid away to leave a twisted frown. "When the hell did you get so tall, man?" Henry said, then turned and walked quickly away, looking back only once to wave Eli after him. Eli followed, wanting nothing more than to get all this over with, hoping that if he obliged he might find a moment alone with Carrie, offer reassurance of his support, despite it being feigned. He wanted her to be happy at any cost, even if he was part of the payment. Henry led Eli through the foyer, then down a small hallway toward an office. Henry went through the door quickly, then let it swing back, nearly closing it behind him. Eli heard laughter as he reached for the knob, hesitated. The door swung open and Parker's massive, hot-headed brother Brock filled the doorframe. His brown eyes blazed and his reddened face was scrunched into a tight-lipped smile of anticipation and hate. He clutched Eli by the knot of his tie and yanked him inside. The door slammed shut behind him. Eli's first thought was that he'd been pulled into a men's locker room. The small, stuffy office smelled of piss and sweat and liquor. He registered 4 bodies, all male, all in black tuxedos. Shit, he thought. Everything that came next happened very, very fast.